I lived in an apartment a few years ago, 4 units upstairs, 4 units downstairs. I lived upstairs, and the apartment below me was vacant. I kept hearing footsteps through the apartment, and I knew I shouldn't have. Nobody was downstairs. I asked someone to come over and listen, just to see if I was crazy. Maybe I'm just hearing other apartments since it's empty downstairs, and everything is echoing. Wrong. I kept hearing the footsteps. This went on for a solid hour. Finally, I called the landlord and the police. Apparently, someone had broken in through the windows downstairs and was walking back and forth through the apartment with a knife. My uncle, like all my other uncles, save two, was a doctor. At the time, he was the equivalent of a general practitioner, although he later became a pediatrician. He was young at the time, and was just 3 years out of medical school. Like many young doctors, he was always eager to prove himself, often at the risk of his own health. This was one of those occasions. After being forced by my grandmother to take a much-needed 2-week vacation, he developed a fever. He refused to admit he was sick, until he literally fainted while attending a patient. He ends up hospitalized for 3 or 4 days, at which point it seemed like he would die. My grandmother, aunt, and my mother all traveled to the hospital, which was pretty far away. They took up residence in a nearby hotel. Eventually, my grandmother decides that her son spends his last days with them in the hotel, under the care of a nurse. My uncle's quite delirious at this point, so a priest comes, gives him the last rites, and the waiting begins. About a week after the fainting, some of my uncle's colleagues visit him to say their last goodbyes. One of them tells my mom of an unorthodox last-ditch solution: bring in a medium. Here's where things get really wild. This medium was a middle-aged woman who supposedly could channel the spirit of a famous Venezuelan doctor and saint named Jose Gregorio Hernandez, who died in 1919. There were certain things she would need to summon the saint, including a stipulation to leave her alone with a patient, a notepad with a pen, and certain local plants which were to be collected by her assistant. My grandmother and her daughters were desperate at this point, so they agreed. They'd leave the medium alone and wait outside for a few hours until the woman emerges. My mother claims that she could hear the voice of an older man murmuring from the inside of the room. The medium comes out and gives them a notepad with a set of instructions. The instructions were for what I suppose could be called a herbal potion. She took no money and left after eating a nice meal, paid for by my family. Meanwhile, her assistant prepared the potion, which was to be given to my uncle every 4 hours. Although it took another week, my uncle eventually recovered for the most part, only losing sight in his left eye. He was fired from the hospital he worked at for working with a fever, at which point he left for the capital, Bogota, and began his specialization in pediatric medicine. His brothers, at this point already established doctors, helped him find a new job despite his incredibly irresponsible actions. He retired a few years ago. Is this story true? I have no idea, as I didn't even exist back then. Even as a child, this story seemed extremely unlikely, But there was always something in the way my mom told it that always creeped me out. My family moved into this house when I was 8, and it was bigger than any else we had before, and had a massive unfinished basement. That basement had windows that lined 3 of the walls, so it wasn't the dark basement that most people think of. But for some reason, I was still terrified of being down there at night. And every time I would go upstairs, I'd sprint upstairs because I felt like something was following me up. For 11 years I went on, and my family acted like it was just my imagination. For the last few years, my dad had moved his office down there since he worked from home, and he was hell-bent on having a guest room in our house. Now, one thing about my dad is he never really stops working. When everyone else is getting off work early on Fridays, he always kept working until he was done. That meant he would be down in the basement way after it got dark. Then, about a year ago, I was back home from college for the summer, and my dad got rid of the guest bedroom after 10 years and moved his office in there. It felt the same when I went down there, but it kept getting worse. I started noticing that my dog would never go down there with me, even though he used to love being down there, since there's space for him to run around. He would stand at the top of the stairs unless I forced him down there. Then, once he was down there, if I took my eye off of him, he would sprint upstairs. It started getting to the point where I was overcome with fear, even walking down there during the day, and I just started avoiding it completely. My dad asked me why I wouldn't go down there, and I told him that I couldn't explain it, and I was just scared. That's when he told me that whenever he was down there after dark, he couldn't bring himself to look away from the computer screen, because he always felt like something was behind him. And that he would sprint upstairs after he turned off his computer, and that he would see shadows and stuff sometimes on his way up. He has a friend that does the psychic medium stuff and told him that while she was visiting, she felt something really evil whenever she passed the basement door. She was worried it would try to hurt us. He also told me that when we first moved in there, I would regularly tell them I saw people in our house, but I've forgotten about that. My dad is the most rational person I know, and even he was scared. He started talking about getting the house cleansed. And over the course of the next 2 months, that feeling of fear and being watched was no longer only in the basement. It was everywhere. It got to a point where even when I was outside, I was scared to look into the house because it felt like something was there. My bedroom is on the second floor of the house. There is no patio or porch or overhang of any kind beneath my windows. A couple of years ago, I was watching TV in bed around 2 a.m. and heard a louder than usual animal sound. Not uncommon to hear squirrels running around on the roof from time to time. I didn't think much of it, but it kept happening and started to sound awfully close to the window and not on the roof. I ignored it for a pretty long time. After at least 40 to 45 minutes of being irritated by the noise, I banged on the wall in hopes of scaring them off until I could get to sleep. Just 2 quick bangs with my fist, which were answered with 2 bangs on the wall right next to the window from outside. Needless to say, I just about crapped myself and jumped out of bed. Now, my living room has a bay window, and is on the other end of the house, so I could look out that window from the side and see my bedroom window. I hustled downstairs and peeked out. I see a guy standing in front of my house, below my bedroom window. He's got a knife, a small pocket knife, in his hand. He's petting the front of my house. I called the police and wait. He never leaves the front of the house, even when they roll up and ultimately disarm him and arrest him without much struggle.